Some of the most disturbing things to ever come out of 4chan were not fictional. They were not experiments, they were not creative writing exercises, and they were not people trying to scare each other for entertainment. They were real events documented in real time, real evidence shared before anyone else knew it existed, and real mysteries that investigators, researchers, and ordinary people have spent years trying to fully understand. Tonight, we are going through 4 of those cases in the kind of detail they actually deserve, because each one of them contains specific details that most coverage glosses over. And those details are often exactly the part that makes the full picture so unsettling. The first case opened on 4chan in late November of 2007, and it started with a post that most people would have assumed was another one of the platform's endless attempts at dark humor. An anonymous user uploaded a photograph of a teenage girl and accompanied it with a short statement. The statement said that if anyone in the thread could correctly guess the unique identification number attached to their own reply, the poster would tell them where she was buried. For context on why this was framed that way, every single post on 4chan is automatically assigned a random numerical identifier when it is submitted. The number cannot be influenced or predicted in any way by the person posting. The odds of accurately guessing your own post number are extremely low. The platform had a long tradition of framing rewards or punishments around this mechanic, but those rewards were almost always jokes, dares, or mildly embarrassing requests. Nobody had ever framed it around the location of a buried body before. The thread filled with users making guesses. About 15 minutes after the original post went live, one user submitted a reply that matched its own identification number exactly. The anonymous original poster responded immediately with a set of geographic coordinates. The coordinates pointed to a stretch of county road roughly 50 miles east of El Dorado, a small city in the state of Kansas, near a patch of trees on the edge of a field. There was nothing obviously significant about the location from looking at a map. It appeared to be a random stretch of nowhere. It was not random. The girl in the photograph was Emily Sander, an 18-year-old student at Butler Community College who had been reported missing for nearly a week at the time of the post. She had last been seen on the evening of November 23rd, leaving a Chinese restaurant in El Dorado alongside a man named Israel Morales. The two of them had spent the evening with her group of friends. Morales had been buying drinks, was sociable and relaxed, and accompanied the group to a nearby bar after dinner. After leaving the bar with Emily, he had not been seen since, and neither had she. Her disappearance had already triggered an active police investigation by the time that post went up. Tips about the 4chan thread reached local authorities within minutes of the coordinates appearing. Officers drove to the location. They found Emily Sanders' body there, partially clothed, at the exact spot the post had described. The discovery was confirmed less than an hour before police made any public announcement about finding her, meaning the post had gone up with that information before anyone in the general public was supposed to know it existed. The investigation had already been zeroing in on Morales. Physical evidence connected him to the crime, including a large knife and clothing carrying his DNA that investigators found at a property connected to him. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but he had already crossed into Mexico by then. Authorities pursued extradition and eventually brought him back to stand trial. He claimed during interrogation that someone else had been involved, that he had returned to a motel room to find Emily already dead, and that he had panicked and disposed of her body out of fear. The jury and the judge found this unconvincing. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The question that the thread never answered was who made that post. Morales was never officially connected to it. The timing of the post relative to the police announcement raised the possibility that someone inside the investigation with knowledge of the location had posted it anonymously before the public statement was made. It also remained possible that Morales had made the post himself, either as some form of twisted confession or to create a trail that would eventually lead police to the body. Both theories have been discussed extensively, and neither has ever been confirmed. What the thread left behind was the image of a guessing game built around the location of a murdered girl, a game that produced an answer, and an answer that turned out to be real. Whatever the motive behind that post, the coordinates were accurate, and the person who typed them out knew exactly where Emily was before any official announcement said so. The comments section that gathered around this case, both when it first emerged and in the years since it became widely circulated, kept returning to the same unanswerable question: why would anyone frame it as a game? Whether the poster was the killer, a law enforcement insider, or someone else entirely, the decision to build a guessing mechanic into the revelation of a murder victim's location was the detail nobody could explain in any satisfying way. It was not needed. The information could have been posted as a tip, as a confession, as anything. The game format was a choice, and whatever that choice meant about the person who made it, it said something deeply uncomfortable about the place where they chose to make it. The second case on tonight's list is one that sits in an unusual space between confirmed tragedy and possible fabrication, and the fact that it cannot be definitively placed in either category is part of what makes it so difficult to let go of. In August of 2009, a user posted on 4chan's mainboard under the title "Look What I Found." The accompanying message was simple. He wrote that he had been going through belongings left by his father after his death and had found something unusual. His father, he explained, had at some point been connected to the military. What he had found in his father's things was a live grenade. He uploaded a photograph of himself holding it. The thread filled quickly. The majority of responses in the first few minutes were skeptical. Users pointed out that old grenades do not necessarily look any different from replica ones and demanded some form of verification. The poster responded to the pressure by uploading a second photograph showing himself holding a cigarette lighter up against the body of the grenade, which was obviously a dangerous thing to do, but which silenced most of the doubts about the metal construction being real. That was where the thread began to shift from skepticism to something else. Rather than recommending that he call a bomb disposal unit or simply leave the house, a significant portion of the replies started encouraging him to experiment with it. The suggestion that gained the most traction was to drop the grenade into the toilet bowl and see what happened, framed by whoever wrote it as a joke about producing an impressive fountain of water. There is a specific kind of dynamic that forms in anonymous online spaces when a large group of people who believe they will not be held accountable begin collectively pushing someone toward a dangerous action. It does not require anyone in particular to commit to it. The suggestion sits there, others repeat it or upvote it. The volume of people saying the same thing creates the illusion of consensus, and the person at the center of it feels the pressure of that consensus without necessarily understanding where it actually comes from. What happened next in the thread appears to have reflected exactly that dynamic. The poster uploaded one more image showing his hand holding the grenade directly over an open toilet bowl with the caption asking whether he should do it. The thread erupted with people telling him to go ahead. Then the poster went completely silent. For several minutes, other users kept posting, asking for updates, asking what had happened, asking if he was still there. There was no response. Then a different user posted a screenshot of a news article in Spanish from a Guatemalan media outlet, dated that same day. The article described the death of a 17-year-old boy named Oscar Lopez, who had been killed after detonating a live grenade in the bathroom of his home. The article mentioned that the boy's father had a military background, which it noted as the probable explanation for the presence of a live military grenade in the family residence. The thread immediately connected the dots. The timing was consistent. The detail about the military father matched what the original poster had said. The circumstance of the bathroom matched the last image posted. Dozens of users condemned the people who had encouraged him to throw it. The story spread from that thread across the internet and has been retold thousands of times since. There is a significant complication, however, and the comments sections that examined the case most carefully always arrived at it eventually. Nobody has ever been able to locate the original Guatemalan news article. Every citation of the story traces back to the same screenshot of a now unverifiable article. Researchers who have spent hours searching Spanish-language newspaper archives from that period have found nothing. The timing of the article's appearance in the thread, published and screenshot and posted within roughly an hour of the poster's last message, was also noted as suspicious. It is possible that someone in the thread fabricated the article to add a dark ending to what had been an increasingly tense situation. It is equally possible that the article was real, that Oscar Lopez died that night, and that the original source simply no longer exists in any accessible archive. What the community was left with And what anyone who looks at this case carefully is still left with is a situation where both possibilities carry genuine weight. If it happened, a 17-year-old died, in part because a crowd of anonymous strangers thought it was funny to tell him to drop a grenade in his toilet, and the internet circled the event for years without ever arriving at certainty. If it was fabricated, whoever staged it understood something specific about how these communities respond to escalation and played that understanding perfectly. Either version of the story is disturbing for its own reasons, and the inability to confirm which one is true has kept it alive in discussions about online influence and anonymous communities for over 15 years. The third case on tonight's list began with a death in the family, which is perhaps the most ordinary possible beginning for something so deeply strange. In August of 2012, a man posted on 4chan's main board to say that his grandfather had passed away at 89 years old, and that the family had sent him to go through the old man's property in preparation for an estate sale. The grandfather had been a World War II Navy veteran who returned from service and never fully adjusted to civilian life. His paranoia became severe and chronic. He rarely let anyone visit his home. When the poster was a teenager and asked his grandfather once about a shelter, the old man had dug into the limestone rock beneath his property. The grandfather told him only that he should never go there and used a word to describe the shelter that the poster could not quite hear clearly. It sounded like a word beginning with O, something like assuer. He had never been able to identify it. With the grandfather gone and the family needing to assess everything for the estate, the poster was sent down into the shelter with a phone for photographs. He expected old gas masks and tinned food from the 1960s, maybe a bottle of water and a deck of cards left over from a nuclear drill that never happened. He went down the entrance, turned through the first hallway, past a crude carved toilet, past shelves of rusted garbage, and then found something that was not in anyone's expectations. At the end of the hallway, where he had expected a dead end, there was an iron door. It was padlocked. The lock had corroded enough over the decades that he was able to knock it apart with a rock he pulled from the floor. The door itself had rusted shut and required significant force to open. Beyond the door was another short passage, ending in a room that felt less like a constructed chamber than a widened natural cavern. He scanned it with his phone light, and the first thing he saw was a carving of a cross cut cleanly into the stone wall. He assumed his grandfather had come down here to pray during whatever crisis pushed him to build the shelter in the first place, and kept moving. Then he saw the faces. Carved into the walls of the chamber at eye level were human faces, 6 or 7 of them, positioned so that each one faced in the direction of the cross. One was clearly feminine, with soft and carefully rendered features. Another was male, heavier-browed and sharper, with an expression that seemed angry or pained. They had all been worked on with real care by someone who had spent a very significant amount of time alone in that sealed underground room, making them. They were not scratches, they were portraits. Below a carving at the far end of the chamber that was clearly intended to be a skull rather than a face, the floor was broken concrete rubble. Protruding from the rubble were bones. He described them as clearly not animal bones, clearly human, as if someone had poured quick-dry concrete over a set of remains and the concrete had cracked and shifted over the decades that followed. He was still absorbing that detail when he heard what he described as a quiet laugh coming from somewhere in the corner of the room behind him. He ran. He ran through the passage, through the iron door, through the hallways, up the entrance steps, and back to the surface, and he did not stop until he was fully outside. When he posted to 4chan and shared the photographs, the thread gathered quickly, and the theories started immediately. One commenter who appeared genuinely knowledgeable proposed that the word the grandfather had used, assuer or something like it, was almost certainly ossuary, a term for a chamber or vessel used to hold human skeletal remains as a final resting place. Ossuaries have existed across multiple cultures and time periods, and include famous examples like the underground chambers beneath Paris. If the grandfather had been building an ossuary, possibly for his wife who had died suddenly without explanation in 1965, that would account for the bones and potentially for the cross carving. It would not account for the individual portraits of faces carved into the walls, or for what the poster heard in the corner before he ran. The photograph of the bones was removed from the thread shortly after being posted. Before the poster could return with any further updates, the entire thread was deleted. It was never properly archived. The only evidence the thread ever existed is a single screenshot that has circulated through various platforms over the years since. The poster never returned to provide any further information, no follow-up from the family, no explanation of what the grandfather may have been doing in that room, or who or what the bones belonged to. The word that sounded like assuer remained the only clue to the old man's intentions, and the interpretation of it as ossuary remained the only theory with any explanatory power over the physical evidence found down there. What nobody in the thread or since has explained is the laughter. The fourth case on tonight's list is one that was documented on a cassette tape in 1995 and sat in a drawer for 18 years before the person who made it decided to share it. A man who was 15 years old at the time had a habit of staying up late listening to the radio and occasionally recording segments that caught his attention using a cassette recorder integrated into his bedroom stereo. On one particular night, he was recording a classical music program on a non-commercial station operating out of Columbia University in New York, the station known as WKCR, at 89.9 FM. He was half asleep with the recorder running when the audio changed, without any introduction or explanation. What replaced the classical music was a layered and deeply unsettling combination of sounds. There was a sustained and irregular screeching, the kind that sits at the edge of what the human voice can produce, and beneath or threaded through it was a rhythm of heavy breathing that repeated and faded and returned in a way that did not follow any natural pattern. This continued for approximately 2.5 minutes. Then a voice began speaking. The voice was rapid and almost completely flat in pitch, a monotone that barely shifted despite the pace of what it was saying. It was reading names. Each name came with a date attached to it and a set of relationship information describing the named person in terms of parents, siblings, and close friends. Barry Valentino, son of Barry Sr., brother of Scott, with a date in December of 1988. Frank, with a brother named Robert, and a father named Michael, with a date in February of 1985. The names kept coming one after another, each with its date and its family context. At irregular intervals throughout the reading, a bell rang. It was not a sharp or bright bell, but a heavy and resonant one, the kind that carries a low frequency and takes a moment to fully decay. The use of bells in this specific context connects to a historical practice in the United Kingdom, stretching back centuries, where bell ringers would walk through streets in public spaces to announce deaths, ringing as they went and naming the deceased so that communities could prepare prayers and make arrangements. In medieval periods, these death bells were additionally believed to ward off malevolent spirits from the bodies of the dead during processions. Whether whoever was responsible for the broadcast was aware of this history, or whether the bell appeared in the recording for some other reason, was something the thread never determined. The voice eventually dissolved from rapid reading into quieter and quieter whispering, and then cut off. The radio host came back on, apologized for the delay to the scheduled programming, noted that the Colombian music segment had been running late, and resumed the broadcast as if nothing unusual had happened. The 15-year-old who had recorded all of it put the tape in a desk drawer and did not share it with anyone for 18 years. He described himself as genuinely traumatized by what he had heard, even though he had been only partially awake when it happened. When he finally posted the recording to 4chan's paranormal board in 2013, the thread began working through the names immediately. Barry Valentino, with the December 1988 date, was identified as one of the victims of the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, in December of 1988. Frank, with the brother named Robert, was identified as Frank Oppenheimer, the brother of Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the American nuclear weapons program during World War II. These two were the only names where a clear historical identification could be made. The other names in the recording led to ordinary obituaries with no obvious connection to each other or to the identified individuals, and nothing clearly linked all of them into a single coherent category. People who were familiar with broadcast radio technology proposed the most rational available explanation, which was that the recording was the work of students at WKCR itself who had put together an experimental or avant-garde program for an overnight slot on a non-commercial station, where oversight was minimal and creative latitude was broad. College radio has a long history of unusual content, and the specific audio characteristics of the recording, which analysts noted were consistent with genuine cassette tape from a non-commercial FM broadcast of that era, supported the idea that it was a legitimate recording of something that had actually aired. The specific sounds, the screeching, the breathing rhythm, the death bell, all had precedence in experimental audio composition from the same period. What that explanation did not account for was the specific names attached to specific real deaths with specific accurate dates. If it was an experimental program, the creators had chosen to incorporate the names and biographical details of real deceased individuals, including at least two with genuinely significant historical connections, and had done so in a format that was clearly modeled on some form of death announcement ritual. Whether that was intentional artistic choice, historical research used as material, or something else entirely, was something the thread could not determine, and nobody involved in making the recording ever came forward to explain. The poster eventually moved the discussion to a Reddit forum and added a section at the end of his account that extended the story in a direction that was clearly fictional, describing the recording as something that would eventually reach anyone who heard it and read out their name when it did. He later confirmed to researchers that the Reddit edition was invented to give the story more narrative weight and was not part of the original experience. He maintained that everything up to that point, the tape, the recording, the names, the 1995 broadcast, was real, and that he had never found a satisfying explanation for any of it. The tape exists. The broadcast occurred. WKCR was the station. The names belonged to real people who died on real dates, and whatever program produced the recording had finished airing before the host came back on to apologize for the delay and return to the scheduled music, leaving no trace of itself beyond what one half-asleep 15-year-old had thought to capture on a cassette tape that sat in a drawer for nearly 2 decades. 4 cases tonight. A guessing game on 4chan that produced accurate coordinates to a murder victim's body. A live grenade and a crowd of strangers, and a thread that went silent at exactly the wrong moment. A bomb shelter carved with human faces and filled with human bones beneath a paranoid old man's property. And a cassette tape recording of a radio broadcast that read out the names of the dead over the sound of a funeral bell in 1995. None of them have clean endings. All of them left something behind that the people who encountered them could not fully explain or fully let go of. That is the nature of the stories that survive long enough to be worth telling.